argument be valid but not sound? What is the relationship between a valid argument and an invalid argument? What distinguishes a valid argument from a sound argument, and why is this distinction so important in logical reasoning? What roles do deductive, inductive, abductive argument, and then argument by analogy play in logical reasoning? Good day, Dr. Oyagiri. We're members of Group 2, and today we're going to be answering these questions. A famous logician, Harold Tarski, said, "A true conclusion that does not follow from the premises gives us no more information than a false conclusion. Validity is independent of the truth or falsity of the premises." For us to understand this topic, we have to go to the foundation of this whole concept, which is logic. So what is logic? Logic is a fundamental discipline in philosophy that involves analyzing the structures of an argument. It helps us to distinguish good reasoning from bad reasoning, and then ensures that the conclusion flows logically from its premises. Logic can also be termed as any systematic study that improves or involves critical thinking and methodological reasoning. Logic is that which evaluates an argument. And a question that goes round: why is logic so important to human cognition? The reason why logic is so important in human cognition is because it helps to determine how ideas reasonably blend together. For us to delve further into this topic, we have to understand the main concern of logic, which is an argument. So what is this argument here? The argument logic speaks about is not physical disputation or exchange of words. An argument in logic is any proposition whose conclusion or judgment is supported by evidence. In simpler words, an argument is a bunch of statements, one or more, of which the premises are claimed to have reasonable justification to its conclusion. An argument is where there is a logical entailment between the premises and the conclusion. And note that there are two main parts of an argument: the premises, which is the main structure of the argument, and then the conclusion, the reasonable justification for holding that position. So an argument can be distinguished into deductive arguments, inductive arguments, abductive arguments, and then arguments by analogy. So what is this deductive argument? To me, I believe that deductive argument is the simplest form of argument, simpler to understand than the rest of them. So deductive argument is a logical process where the conclusion flows from its premises in a logical manner. And these conclusions are drawn from a set of premises that are generally assumed to be true, whereby transmitting justification. An example of this, all girls are black. Toby is a girl, therefore Toby is black. This is an example of deductive argument. Moving on to inductive argument. An inductive argument involves the general conclusion derived from specific instances or specific observations. For instance, Dr. Oyagiri surveys or observes 20 Babcock University students, and from his observation, he finds out that these 20 Babcock University students are all Seventh-day Adventists. So the universal categorical proposition determines that all Babcock University students are Seventh-day Adventists, even though this may not be true. Dr. Oyagiri assumes this because it is an example of inductive argument. So now we have abductive argument. What is abductive argument? Abductive argument is a little bit tricky, but kind of easy to understand. Abductive argument typically begins with a set of incomplete observations and then proceeds to likeliest possible explanation. It does not start with complete observations, and it is this form of reasoning that proceeds to likeliest, simplest, most likely possible explanations. An example of this: I'm currently at SRC now. I walk into SRC in the morning and I find out that the windows are open and the floor is wet. There are two possible explanations for this. It's either someone came here before me and opened the windows and spilled water on the floor, or the windows were open and it rained overnight. So the likeliest and most reasonable explanation to this is that it rained overnight, so it probably rained. And lastly, we have arguments by analogy. Argument by analogy is comparing two things of similar respects, characteristics, attributes, you name it, side by side, and then assuming that they are the same in other aspects, just because they are the same in this particular aspect. For instance, encouraging students to participate in church activities is like encouraging them to participate in physical exercises. Just like church activities stimulates spiritual well-being, physical exercises also stimulates body well-being, physical well-being, and mental well-being. Thank you.
Good morning, sir. My name is OKATA Chris, and I'm here to talk about logic as a study of argumentation. However, logic as a study of argumentation investigates the principles and criteria used to evaluate evaluates the validity and the soundness of arguments. It's a fundamental branch of philosophy that focuses on the understanding and analyzing how arguments are constructed and how conclusions follow from premises. We have two core components of logic, and they are argument and proposition. Argument comprises of a set of propositions or elements where some of the premises are intended to support another, while proposition is a declarative sentence that is either true or false. So we have types of logic, which are deductive logic and inductive logic. Deductive logic now is concerned with the arguments where the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion, while inductive logic deals with the arguments where premises support the conclusion probabilistically. Now we have logical forms and structures. We have syllogism, we have modus ponens, etc. Now we have logical fallacies. There are also two types of logical fallacies, which are formal fallacies and informal fallacies. Now, formal fallacies, they are errors in logical forms of an argument that invalidate in its deductive reasoning, while informal fallacies are errors in reasoning that arise from the content or context of the argument rather than its structure. Now we have systems of logic. There are also two types in systems of logic, which are classical logic and non-classical logic. Now, classical logic, based on principles like the law of non-contradiction, which states that a statement cannot be true and false at the same time, and the law of excluded middle, which says that a statement is either true or false. Now we have non-classical logic. This includes systems like modal logic, which is concerned with the necessity and possibility, etc. Now we have application of logic. We have philosophical analysis and mathematics and computer science. Now in conclusion, logic as a study of argumentation provides essential tools for analyzing the structure and validity of arguments. Thank you.
My name is ONYEMAOBI and I'll be talking about arguments, elements of an argument, and classification of an argument. Basically, understanding what an argument is important because it forms the foundation for logical reasoning. An argument may be defined as a group of statements whereby a particular statement, often known as the premises, is offered in support of another statement known as the conclusion. The premises are intended to give reason and evidence for the conclusion. So basically, an argument is usually an attempt to persuade a person by supporting a true statement with a corresponding premises. By doing so, the argument states an implication, which is a logical process of deriving the truth of an argument, the truth of a conclusion, from the certainty of the premises. However, it is important to note that premises are in place to act as evidence for the conclusion, so they do not necessarily have to be true, which is why we have valid and invalid arguments, sound and unsound arguments. Moving on to elements of an argument. We have two schools that speak on the elements of an argument. We have the traditional school and we have the contemporary school. Under the contemporary school, we have four parts of an argument, which is the claim, and this is basically the main argument, is the foundation of the argument. We have the counterclaim, which seeks to invalidate the main claim. We have the reason or evidence, which provides evidence or provides proof for the conclusion, and then we have the conclusion, which is the final judgment gotten from the premises before. Then moving on to the traditional school, we have three parts in the traditional school, which is the premises, which is the fact of an argument, and it can either be universal or particular. We have the inference, which is the reasoning part of an argument and also acts as the proof. And then lastly, we have the conclusion, which is the final inference gotten from the premises listed previously. Lastly, an argument can be classified into two. We have inductive and deductive arguments and simple and complex arguments. I'll be handing over to my colleague KENECHI to talk more on deductive arguments.
The next topic I'll be taking is sound and unsound arguments. A sound argument is a valid deductive argument in which all the premises are true, while an unsound argument is a deductive argument in which at least one of the premises are false. It is important to know that all sound arguments are valid, but not all valid arguments are sound. Also, this can also be taken as all invalid arguments are automatically unsound, but not all unsound arguments are valid. I'll be giving a few examples to illustrate this concept. The first example, is in the work provided. The first example was provided in the paper submitted. All Adeleke University students are truthful. Yemkem is a student of Adeleke University. Therefore, Yemkem is truthful. We can deduce that this argument is valid because the conclusion flows from the premises. That means the premises guarantee it, but it is not sound. Why is it not sound? We have an untrue statement, which is the first premise. All Adeleke University students are truthful. It is not possible for all university students to be truthful. Therefore, this is an unsound argument, but it is valid. It flows, but it has at least one false premise. The next example I'll be taking is the second one. All marriages celebrated under the Marriage Act are valid. Biola and Ngozi celebrated their marriage under this act. Therefore, their marriage is valid. We can see that this deductive argument is a valid deductive argument because the conclusion flows from the premises. And it is also sound because all the premises are true. The example I'll be giving is an invalid argument which automatically makes it unsound. All birds fly. All dogs are birds. Therefore, all dogs are vertebrates. We can see that the conclusion does not flow from the premises, therefore automatically making it unsound. Not only that, all birds do not fly and all dogs are not birds. So we have the conclusion not flowing from the premise and untrue premises, therefore making this invalid and automatically unsound. Thank you.
Hey class, my name is OMOTUBORA and I will be discussing the validity and invalidity of a deductive argument. Firstly, what is a deductive argument? A deductive argument is a form of reasoning in which the conclusion flows from the premise logically. Hey class, my name is OMOTUBORA and I will be discussing the validity and invalidity of a deductive argument. Firstly, what is a deductive argument? A deductive argument is a form of reasoning in which the conclusion logically flows from the premises. It means, therefore, that if the premises are true, the conclusion is also true. In other words, a deductive argument is a logical process in which a specific conclusion is derived from a general set of statements or premises. The strength of a deductive argument is in the structure. If the argument is valid, therefore, the truth of the conclusion is guaranteed by the truth of the premises. So I would like to also talk about valid and invalid argument. What is a valid argument? A valid argument is a type of deductive argument in which it is impossible for the conclusion to be false, given that the premises are true. In this type of argument, the conclusion logically flows with strict necessity from the premises. An example is Socrates. Can you pause it? An example is all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is immortal. You can see the way the conclusion is derived from the premises. Conversely, an invalid argument is one where it is possible for the conclusion to be false, given that the premises are true. The conclusion does not logically flow from the premise. The flaw in a deductive argument lies with the structure, not the truth or the falsity of the statement. So I will now be discussing the main being of this statement, the invalidity and validity of an argument. Validity is determined by the relationship between the premise and the conclusion. The question here is not whether the premise is true or false, but whether it is justified or well supported by the conclusion. The fundamental logical property of a deductive argument is this: if the premises are true, the conclusion should also be true. If the argument is valid, the truth of the conclusion is determined and justified by the truth of the premises. A simple determination of how to know whether an argument is valid is a simple question. Is there a scenario where the premises of a particular argument would be true, but the conclusion would still be false? If such a scenario exists, that means the argument is invalid, but if not, the argument is valid. So, test on validity. Test on validity is basically exists to assess whether the conclusion logically flows from the premise. Number, we have a truth table. This enumerates systematically the values of the premises and the conclusion, and it is used to evaluate arguments that are expressed in propositional logic using and or not. The imagery of the truth table has been sent to the group chat, which can be found on page 7 of our document. Moving on, formal proof. This exists to justify how the conclusion flows logically from the premise, using the set of accepted rules and justified by the steps. An example is all men are mortals. Premise: Socrates is a man. premise, therefore Socrates is a mortal. Conclusion. Then we have counter-example method. This involves finding a scenario where in an argument where the conclusion will be false given that the premises are true. If such scenario exists, that means the argument is invalid, and if the scenario doesn't exist, that means the argument is valid. So an example of that is all cats have tails. This animal has a tail, then this animal is a cat. But a counter example of that would be the existence of a dog. A dog also has a tail. That means the argument is invalid, but because that animal could have been a dog. Then logical analysis. This involves using logical principles and common sense to find the coherent elements and identify the logical fallacies. Now I want to talk about the role of valid and invalid arguments in logical reasoning. The role of valid arguments in logical reasoning: certainty and reliability. Valid arguments possess high level of certainty, therefore, because it guarantees that if the premises are true, the conclusion is also true. It can be used in mathematics, formal logic, and scientific experiments where accuracy and correctness is prominent. Then we have sound reasoning. Valid argument is based on truth, so therefore it guarantees sound reasoning and also be able to make this good decision making based on sound reasoning. Then we have promotion of intellectual rigor. Because you want to make an argument as valid as possible, you tax your brain and mental capacity in order to ensure that the conclusion is guaranteed and supported by the premises. Then we have role of invalid argument in logical reasoning. We have detection of fallacies. Through the use of invalid arguments, the detection of fallacies are easier, and also detection of error in reasoning. Then we have challenge to assumptions. Valid and invalid arguments, because it ensures that there are challenges to assertion and assumption in order to pinpoint where a conclusion is not adequately supported by the premises. Another one is...
Good day everyone, my name is EKPENDU OLACHI, and I'll be talking about the relationship between validity and soundness in deductive arguments. So validity and soundness are very important concepts in deductive arguments. It has already been established that a deductive argument aims to be valid and sound. A valid argument is an argument in which the conclusion is guaranteed by the premises. If not, it is invalid. And a sound argument, on the other hand, is an argument that fulfills three conditions. The first condition is that the premises must be sound, must be true. The conclusion must also be true, and the conclusion must be guaranteed by the premises. Therefore, a deductive argument, if it is a good argument, is structured in a certain way that it is impossible for the conclusion to be false while the premise is true, because the conclusion directly flows from the premise. So the relationship between validity and soundness can be viewed in two ways. The first is the composition of a valid argument and a sound argument, and the second is the composition of a good argument. A good argument in logic is one that fulfills two conditions. The first one is logical condition, and the second one is the truth or the plausibility condition. The logical condition is validity. Validity is the strongest logical glue between the premises and the conclusion. Consider the following example. All boys are dogs. Tim is a boy. Therefore, Tim is a dog. If you look at the statement, it doesn't matter the specific content of the statement, but the structure. It is structured in a certain way that the conclusion, Tim is a dog, directly flows from the premises. All boys are dogs and Tim is a boy. So, if you look at it this way, a valid argument has nothing to do with the truth of the argument. It only has to do with the logical form of the argument. The logical form is the separation of the elements of the discourse from the structure of the argument. Then the second one is the truth condition or the plausibility condition. The truth condition is basically soundness. An argument is sound when the premises are true, the conclusion is true, and the conclusion guarantees the premises. So the truth condition is important in an instance where I am giving an argument or argumentation and I want my audience or I want the spectators to believe what I am saying. The truth condition is basically in a certain ways, how true is this argument, how probable is this argument, and how certain does the conclusion flow from, or how certain is the conclusion by the way the premises are given. So the truth condition has to do with the specific content of the argument, validity has to do with the structure of the argument, and soundness has to do with the specific content of the argument. Validity and soundness, logical condition and plausibility condition make a good deductive argument. Also, it is important to know that
All sound arguments are valid, but not all valid arguments are sound. Likewise, all unsound arguments are invalid, but not all invalid arguments are unsound. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. I'm Jason OMORU, and I'll be taking abductive argument and arguments by analogy. Arguments by analogy is an argument that seems to show that because two things are similar, we can make the same conclusion about one as we make for the other. For example, John's parents are an authority figure to him, so he treats them with respect. John's teachers are also an authority figure to him, so he will treat them with respect. Abductive argument is a form of reasoning that seeks to enter the most plausible explanation or hypothesis based on the available evidence. This occurs in situations whereby the available evidence is rather uncertain or insufficient. Examples are the grass in the garden is wet, there are water droplets on the leaves, and the ground is damp. It rained last night, therefore the wet grass is from the rain.
Good day, everyone. So I am OMOLE OKIKIOLUWA. I'll be taking the differences between inductive, deductive, abductive, and analogical. And I know we are all familiar with inductive and deductive arguments. And it is agreed for inductive argument, the conclusion probable flows from the premises. And the premises supports but do not guarantee its conclusion. And for deductive argument, the conclusion certainly flows from the premises. The premises support and do guarantee its conclusion. Now, for abductive arguments, we are not familiar with abductive arguments. But abductive argument is a type of inductive argument, just that it flows from an incomplete observation to the best prediction. Let me give you an example. Kemi comes to the class and discovers that the speaker is wet. She asks Lovett, what happened to the speaker? Lovett to say that it must have been the rain. Do you get? In abductive argument, just give you this assurance that your conclusion is very strong. It's a strong argument. So I give an example in the assignment that, a Babcock student is smart. Instead of generalizing it, unlike inductive arguments, like, this Babcock student is smart. Now, for analogical argument is conclusion derived from basic similarities. What do I mean by that? So, let me give you an example. If Kemi behaves respectfully towards her parents, she will definitely behave respectfully towards her teachers. Now, look at the analog. The analog is Kemi's parents. The inferred analog is Kemi's teachers. And the basic similarities is respectfully. So, the difference, in a concise summary, the difference between inductive, deductive, abductive, and analogical. For inductive, it flows from a specific observation to a general conclusion. For deductive, it flows from a general observation to a specific conclusion. For abductive, it flows from an incomplete observation to the best prediction. Then for analogical, its conclusion is derived from basic similarities. Thank you so much.
Good day, everyone. My name is ADEBIYI SALOME, and I'll be talking about the rules of classification of arguments in logic. Arguments are classified in logic for us to understand reasoning processes, and there are various purposes of classification of arguments in logic, one of which is evaluation. Classification of arguments in logic helps us to examine the quality of arguments. For example, deductive arguments are scrutinized for their validity and soundness, and inductive arguments are examined for their strength and cogency. 2. It helps us in communication. Classification of arguments in logic helps us to communicate our ideas effectively and enhance clarity. For example, if an inductive argument is presented as a deductive argument, it will mislead the audience. So classification of arguments in logic is necessary. 3. It enhances critical thinking. Classification of arguments in logic helps us to know the types of reasoning, recognize assumptions, and know how the premises affect the conclusion. 4. It helps us in avoiding common logical fallacies. Classification of arguments in logic helps us to avoid common logical fallacies, which are errors that occur in reasoning. And these common logical fallacies are more prevalent in some types of arguments. For example, in inductive arguments, we have hasty generalization and false cause, and in deductive arguments, we have affirming the consequent and denying the antecedents. Classification of arguments in logic can be applied in various branches of knowledge. For example, philosophy. Deductive arguments are used to make rigorous proofs, and inductive arguments are used to make formulate theories based on empirical evidence. In science, inductive arguments are used to formulate theories or formulate hypotheses, and deductive reasoning is used to test those hypotheses. And in everyday reasoning, we use deductive and inductive arguments to justify beliefs and make decisions. For example, planning based on pattern, it can be known as inductive reasoning, and following rules is deductive reasoning. So in all, deductive and inductive argument, that's classification of argument in logic, is very essential in understanding reasoning process and avoiding common logical fallacies. Thank you.
ALABI, Wuraola, and I am going to be talking about the importance of the application of logical principles in argumentation. Firstly, what do we understand by logical principles? Logical principles are fundamental rules that govern our reasoning and ensure the consistency of an argument. They form the basis of logic, which is the studying of valid reasoning and used to distinguish correct reasoning from incorrect reasoning. They help to ensure conclusions drawn from premises are sound and valid. These principles include concepts of non-contradiction, law of excluded middle, law of identity, and so on. The application of logical principles in argumentation is crucial for several reasons. Firstly, ensuring validity and soundness. A valid argument is one where the conclusion logically flows from the premises. Logical principles ensures that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. If you do not adhere to the rules of logical principles, then the premises might seem convincing at the surface, but will come out like structurally flawed. Examples are: if it rains, the ground gets wet. It is raining, therefore the ground is wet. This is a valid argument because the conclusion logically flows from the premises. 2. Promoting clarity and precision. Logical principles help in expressing ideas precisely and in a way that you understand ideas in a systematic and understandable manner. Clear arguments reduce misunderstanding and misinterpretations. 3. Avoiding fallacies. As we know, logical principles help identity and avoid fallacies, which are errors in reasoning that undermine the validity of an argument. 4. Facilitating critical thinking. Applying logical principles encourages critical thinking by requiring individuals to systematically evaluate the structure and content of arguments. 5. Enhancing problem-solving skills. Logical principles provide a systematic approach to identifying, analyzing, and solving problems. Thank you.
Above, we see the relationship between sound and valid arguments. As valid arguments is one where the conclusion logically follows the premises, while a sound argument is both valid and has true premises. All sound arguments are valid, but not all valid arguments are sound. Sound arguments are considered the gold standard in logic because they are both logically valid and factually accurate, making them highly reliable and persuasive. In the same vein, the various forms of arguments, deductive, inductive, abductive, and analogical, have been differentiated according to their similar but eventually varying nature, as abductive reasoning is about forming the best explanation or hypothesis to prove and to explain a set of observations. Deductive reasoning is more straightforward. Is a more straightforward form of reasoning. It involves moving from general principles to specific conclusions. Arguments are by analogy. Is when you compare two similar things and argue that because they are certain in particular prospects, they are certain in all prospects. And then arguments by analogy, where you compare two similar things and argue that because they are alike in certain aspects, they are likely to be alike in others. For example, if a new medication should work, if somebody has a sickness and a new medication should work for that person, if another person has particular symptoms to that sickness, that new medication will be considered as the cure too. Conclusively, we see the strength of reasoning, identifying logical fallacies, and make more informed decisions based on sound logic. These arguments serve as the foundation of logical reasoning, ensuring that conclusions are well supported and logically consistent. Thank you.